Nobody warns you when they pin the metal ribbon to your new tunic and tell you that you are now a guard of Harrowgate Palace, that the hardest part of the work is not the standing, it is the seeing. I was 3 weeks into my post the first time I understood that, and the woman who taught it to me never once looked at me long enough to know she was teaching. Her name was Lady Ottiline Verrick, and on the morning I am going to tell you about she came down the long colonnade of the palace like weather. That is the only word I have ever found for it. She did not walk into a room so much as she arrived over it, the way a cold front arrives, and the temperature of every person present changed to match her before she had said a word. I was standing my post at the foot of the colonnade, at the tall bronze doors that open onto the ceremony court, and I had been ordered, as new guards always are, to be a fixture, to stand, to see nothing, hear nothing, be nothing but a straight red line against the pale stone. So I stood, and I looked at the middle distance the way I had been drilled to, and Lady Verrick swept past me close enough that the hem of her gray silk brushed the toe of my boot, and she never saw me at all. That is the first thing you learn as a guard, and the thing no one tells you it will cost. To people like Lady Verrick, we are furniture. Handsome furniture, brass-buttoned and bearskinned, arranged along the walls to make the palace look the way a palace is supposed to look, but furniture all the same. A chair does not overhear. A column does not judge. And so, in front of us, the great people of the court say the things they would never say in front of a person, and do the things they would never do in front of a witness, because they have decided we are not witnesses. We are decoration. That decision is the only freedom a guard is ever handed, and by the end of the story I am telling you, I had learned to use it the way my older comrades used it, as a place to stand and see the whole truth of a thing while the world believed I saw nothing at all. But that morning I was still new, and I still flinched inside when I saw a cruelty, and I had not yet built the stillness that would let me watch what was coming without breaking. Lady Verrick taught me that stillness. She did it by being the most beautifully, completely composed person I had ever seen. And then, months later, by losing that composure so utterly, so publicly, in front of the one guard she had never once looked at, that I understood at last what all my drilling had been for. Let me tell you who she was, so that you understand what her unraveling meant. Lady Ottiline Verrick was the mistress of the ceremonies of the Kingdom of Eldermoor, and keeper of the court calendar, which are two titles that sound like nothing and were, in truth, a kind of throne. She decided the shape of every public moment the crown made, who processed and in what order, who bowed to whom and how deeply, which banner hung above which door, where a visiting lord stood and where he was made to wait, how long a ceremony ran and where the light fell and what the realm saw when it looked at its own monarchy. None of that is written in any law of Eldermoor. All of it was hers. For 11 years she had held the pageantry of the crown in her two gloved hands and shaped it into a thing that ran on her taste and her permission. And she had done it so gracefully that most of the court had forgotten it could be done any other way. She believed, and this is the center of everything, so hold on to it, that the pageantry was the monarchy. That the bowing and the banners and the perfect order of a procession were not the decoration of power but the substance of it. To Lady Verrick, a crown that appeared magnificent was magnificent, and a crown that appeared humble had made itself small, and there was no difference between how a thing looked and what a thing was. She had built her whole long life on that belief, and the belief had served her, because for 11 years she had been the one who made the crown look magnificent, which meant, in her own private reckoning, that she was the one who made it real. And she did not think much of the Queen. That is the thing you learn slowly, from a post watching. Not that Lady Verrick opposed Queen Saralind. Opposition is a loud thing, and Lady Verrick was never loud, but that she had decided, somewhere in her clever and certain heart, that the Queen was a pretty ornament she had been given to arrange. Saralind had come to the throne young. She dressed plainly when the calendar did not demand otherwise. She preferred a small supper with her children to a great banquet, and a quiet hour reading petitions to an hour being admired. To Lady Verrick, all of that was a kind of failure of understanding. The Queen simply did not grasp, poor dear, that a monarch who does not perform her magnificence gives it away. And so Lady Verrick had appointed herself, silently, to perform it on the Queen's behalf. To arrange the ornament so beautifully that the realm would never notice the ornament did not know what it was for. I will tell you now what kind of person the Queen actually was, because it is the whole of why the story ends the way it does, and because I came, over that winter, to love her the plain hard way that a guard is permitted to love a sovereign, with my whole discipline and none of my words. Queen Saralind of the royal house of Harrowgate was 34 years old that year. She had a husband, the Prince Consort Aldrich, a steady, quiet man who was proud to stand a half step behind her and never once minded it. She had 2 children, Prince Joran, who was 10 and solemn as a small judge, and Princess Malin, who was 8 and solemn as a firework. And she was good. I do not mean pleasant, though she was pleasant. I mean good in the way that is heavy to carry, the way that costs something every single day and does not ask to be thanked for the cost. She read the petitions herself, late, by candlelight, when the calendar released her. She knew the names of the people who scrubbed the floors and the names of their children. When a hard thing came to her, I heard her more than once ask the empty gallery. The gallery she believed was empty, because the furniture heard everything, not what is easiest, but what is right, and what will it cost, and can I bear the cost? 3 questions, always in that order. I have built my life on having overheard them. So this is a story about 2 women who could not have understood each other if they had tried for 100 years. One believed the crown was how it looked. The other believed the crown was what it did. For 11 years the first had arranged the second like a jewel on a cushion, and the realm had seen the jewel and admired it, and Lady Verrick had been content, because the arrangement was hers, and therefore the magnificence was hers. But that winter a river was going to rise, and a town was going to drown, and the Queen was going to do the one thing that the whole of Lady Verrick's beautiful arrangement had no place for. She was going to step down off the cushion and walk into the water. And I, 3 weeks into my post and forbidden to move, was going to see every moment of what that did to a drowning town, to a watching realm, and to the proudest woman in the palace, whose entire life was built on the certainty that a queen who made herself small had made herself nothing, and who was about to watch a queen make herself small and win a kingdom's whole heart by doing it. But I am ahead of myself. Let me begin where it began for me, with the jubilee, and with a small cruelty I watched Lady Verrick perform a full month before the river ever rose, the cruelty that told me the season was going to be a hard one to stand still through. The Jubilee was to mark 10 years since Saralind's crowning, and it was, from the moment Lady Verrick took hold of it, the largest thing the Kingdom of Eldermoor had attempted in a generation. She meant it to be. I heard her say so, in the ceremony court one gray afternoon, to the junior masters of pageant who trailed her like ducklings and wrote down everything she breathed. This will not be a celebration, she told them, standing beneath the great unfinished scaffold where the Jubilee dais was rising. A celebration is a thing people enjoy and forget. This will be a definition. When it is done, no one in this realm will ever again be able to picture the crown without picturing what we build here. That is the work, not to please them. To fix them, to fix the image of the monarchy in their minds so hard that it can never come loose. She said fix the way a surgeon says it, and the way a taxidermist says it, both at once, and I stood my post at the bronze doors and felt the cold of it go down my spine, and I did not yet understand why. I understood a little better a week after that, when Mistress Haldon came. Mistress Haldon was the palace's chief of the household stores, a broad, plain, tireless woman who had run the great cellars and granaries and coffers of Harrowgate for 30 years and knew, to the sack and the barrel, what the crown had and what the crown could spare. She had come to Lady Verrick that morning not to argue but to warn, which is a different and braver thing. I was standing the post inside the calendar room, where Lady Verrick worked, and so I heard all of it, because Mistress Haldon was furniture blind the way the great ones are, and Lady Verrick had long since stopped seeing me at all. "My lady," Mistress Haldon said, "I've costed the jubilee as you've drawn it, the lights alone, the imported flowers, the 2,000 candles, the cloth of silver, the feast for 4 days." She laid a sheet of figures on the table. "It will empty the winter reserve, not strain it, empty it. Every barrel of grain and cask of oil and coin of the relief coffer that the crown holds against a hard season, it will all go into 4 days of light. And it is a hard winter coming, my lady. The river towns had a poor harvest. If anything goes wrong down the valley this year, a freeze, a flood, a fever, we will have nothing left to send them. We will have spent it on candles." There was a silence, and in that silence I learned the exact temperature of Lady Verrick's heart, and I have never forgotten it. "Mistress Haldon," she said, and her voice was warm, patient, almost fond, the voice you use with a child who has said something well-meaning and wrong. "You count barrels. It is good work. It is your work, do it. But you must let me count what cannot be counted. Do you know what a magnificent crown is worth to the river towns in a hard year, more than grain? A frightened people needs to look up and see a monarchy that is unshaken, unlowered, undiminished, a fixed star. That is worth more to them than any barrel of oil, because it is the thing that tells them the world is still standing. We are not spending the reserve on candles. We are spending it on the one thing that keeps a realm from despair, which is the certainty that the crown above them is greater than any storm below. Now," she slid the sheet of figures back across the table without looking at it, "the reserve is committed. Draw it all, and do not come to me again with the arithmetic of small imaginations." Mistress Haldon stood a moment. She was not a woman who was easily moved, and she was not moved now. She was something worse, something I saw settle over her broad, plain face like frost. She had understood that she had been overruled not by an argument but by a certainty, and that there was no arguing with a certainty. She gathered her sheet of figures. "As you say, my lady," she said, and she left. And as she passed my post she looked at me, the first person of the court in 3 weeks to look at me, and something passed between us, guard and storekeeper, that had no words. She had seen the same cold I had seen. She knew, the way I was only beginning to know, that a decision had just been made in that room that a river was going to punish somebody for. I stood my post. I did nothing. That is the whole of what a guard is permitted to do, and it is the hardest thing in the world. I had watched a woman try to save the winter reserve of a kingdom and be dismissed for the smallness of her imagination, and I had watched the person who dismissed her do it in a voice of such warm certainty that she plainly counted it a kindness, and I could not say one word. I fixed my eyes on the carved rose in the far cornice, and I held my face still, and I felt the new guard flinch go through me. The one my older comrades had lost and I had not, and I understood, standing there, that the winter was going to be a long lesson in the cost of stillness. Because here is what I could see, 3 weeks into my post, that Lady Verrick in 11 years had never once let herself see. The jubilee was not for the realm, it was for her. She had built her whole standing on being the one who made the crown magnificent, and a jubilee this vast would make the crown so magnificent, and so unmistakably by her hand, that her place at the center of Eldermoor would be fixed forever, fixed, the way she liked to say, so hard it could never come loose. She had told herself a beautiful story in which pouring the kingdom's whole winter safety into 4 days of light was an act of care for a frightened people. But under the story, in the place where she did not look, it was an act of care for herself, and she had committed the realm to it so completely that if a hard season came, if the river she had been warned about actually rose, the crown would have nothing left to answer it with. She had, in the name of the Queen's magnificence, quietly stripped the Queen of the power to be good when it mattered most. She did not know she had done that. That is the thing about people like Lady Verrick, and I did not learn it from a book, I learned it from a post, watching her for a winter. Their cruelty is not the loud kind that knows itself. It is the kind wrapped so completely in a story of their own necessity that they sleep soundly on top of it. Lady Verrick went home that night, I am certain, believing she had defended the crown's dignity against a small-minded clerk. She did not know she had loaded a weapon and left it lying where the winter could reach it. Neither did I entirely. I only knew that the season had turned hard, and that I would have to stand and watch it and say nothing until the moment, if it ever came, when duty itself told me to speak. It came, but not for a long while, and a great deal happened first. The weeks that followed taught me the shape of Lady Verrick's second and subtler cruelty, the one aimed not at a storekeeper but at the Queen herself, and it was so quiet, so wrapped in helpfulness, that I do not think Saralind saw it clearly until it was nearly done. Lady Verrick set out, that autumn, to make the Queen small. Not to insult her, that would have been loud, and Lady Verrick was never loud, but to arrange her, over and over, into the role of ornament, until the whole court, and eventually the whole realm, could no longer picture her as anything else. It was done through the calendar, which was hers, and through 100 tiny decisions that no single one of which could be called an offense. I saw it first at the harvest audience, where the Queen was to receive the delegations of the shires. It had always been a working day. The sovereign heard the reeves and the elders, learned what the year had done to the far corners of the realm, and answered them. That was the kind of day Saralind was made for. I had seen her lean forward at such audiences, forget her posture entirely, ask a grain reeve about the price of seed as though nothing in the world mattered more, and win a hard old man's whole loyalty with the accuracy of her attention. But Lady Verrick had rebuilt the harvest audience. She had turned it into a spectacle, a procession, a raised throne, a strict order of approach, courtiers arranged in tiers of descending glory, and a rule, gently enforced by the masters of ceremony, that each delegation had precisely 90 seconds at the foot of the dais before the next was moved forward to honor them all equally so that none feels slighted. It sounded like fairness. It was a muzzle. 90 seconds is enough to be seen, and not enough to be heard. The Queen sat on her high throne in her heavy robes of state, magnificent and remote, and unable to lean forward and ask a single real question, while the shires filed past her like a river past a statue, and went home having been shown a jewel instead of having spoken to a queen. I stood the post at the side of that dais all day, and I watched Saralind understand what had been done to her, slowly, delegation by delegation. I watched her try once to break the arrangement. She leaned forward and began to ask an old woman from the eastern fens a real question, about the flooding of the low fields, and I saw a flicker of the true Queen come alive in her face. And I watched Lady Verrick, standing at the base of the dais with her master's staff, make a small graceful gesture, and the master of ceremonies step smoothly forward, and the old woman be thanked and turned and moved gently away before she could answer. It was done so beautifully that the old woman herself did not understand she had been silenced. She left believing she had been honored by 90 seconds in a queen's magnificent presence. Only the Queen understood. Only the Queen, and the storekeeper who watched from the gallery with frost on her face, and the new guard at the side of the dais, who was learning that hour what her stillness was going to cost her. I will tell you the truth. I nearly moved. There is no rule in the palace against a guard shifting his weight, but there is a discipline against a guard letting his face be read, and my face wanted to be read. It wanted to turn to Lady Verrick and let her see what I thought of the 90 seconds. My older comrade at the far post, a silver-haired man named Corvith who had stood the palace floor for 26 years, must have felt it come off me across the whole width of the hall, because when the audience broke and we stood down, he found me in the guardroom, and he said the truest thing anyone said to me that winter. "You saw it," he said. "It was not a question. I saw it. And you want to know how I stand there for 26 years and watch that and not go to pieces?" He sat down heavily and unbuckled his chin strap. "I'll tell you, because someone told me my first winter. The stillness isn't about not caring, girl. Any fool can stand still if he doesn't care. The stillness is about caring so hard you'd break the world open, and holding it anyway, because you're holding it is the wall the frightened stand behind. You think the queen doesn't know you saw. She knows. She counts on it. On a hard day, the only friend a good sovereign has in the room is the guard who saw the same wrong she saw and stood as still as she had to stand. That's not furniture. That's the last honest witness in a palace full of arrangers. Now fix your face and be worth it. I have thought about that speech 1,000 times. It was the beginning of the guard I became. But that night it only made the burden heavier, because now I could not even pretend I was furniture. I was a witness who could not testify, standing wall against a wrong, and the wrong went on getting larger. Because the harvest audience was only the beginning. Through the autumn, Lady Verrick arranged the queen smaller and smaller. She filled the calendar with pageant, ceremonial receivings, robings, blessings, tableaus. Each one a golden cage that displayed Saralind and prevented her from acting. She let it be known, softly, through the channels a Mistress of Ceremonies controls, that the jubilee would be the true expression of the reign, and that the queen's plainer instincts, her petitions, her suppers, her habit of learning names were charming private virtues that had no place in the great public definition of the crown. She was not undermining the queen. She would have been genuinely wounded by the accusation. She was, in her own certain heart, protecting the queen from her own smallness, building around her a magnificence so total that the realm would love the image whether or not it ever met the woman. And the terrible thing, the thing I could hardly bear to watch, was that it was working. The court began to speak of the queen the way you speak of a beautiful thing rather than a person. The jubilee grew in every mind until it blotted out everything else. And the winter reserve, the grain, the oil, the relief coffer, the whole safety of the river valley, poured barrel by barrel and coin by coin into the rising scaffold of the dais, and the crates of imported flowers and the 2,000 candles, exactly as Mistress Haldon had warned, while the sky over the western valley went the color of old iron and stayed there, and the river that fed the town of Merrowfen began, very quietly, to rise. The word came on the coldest night of the year, 4 days before the jubilee, and it came to the palace the way bad news always comes, at the wrong hour, to the wrong door, carried by a person nobody had prepared to receive. I was on the night post at the riverside gate, the small water gate at the back of the palace where the road comes up from the valley, and it was past midnight, and the cold was the kind that gets into the seams of a man's discipline and tries to make him shiver. A rider came up the valley road so hard I heard him before I saw him, a horse ridden past the edge of its strength, its breath tearing out of it in the freezing dark, and he half fell out of the saddle at my gate, a young man caked to the waist in river mud and ice, and he could barely form the words for the cold and the fear. Merrowfen, he got out, the river's over the north wall, the whole low town's under water. There are people on the roofs, old ones, little ones, and the water's still rising and the ice is coming down with it. We sent to the crown. We sent for the reserve, for boats, for grain, for the relief coffer. We sent 3 days ago and heard nothing, and now half the town's in the water, and I rode to ask why the crown hasn't come. He gripped the bars of my gate with hands that had gone past feeling. Why hasn't the crown come? I knew why. God help me. I knew exactly why, because I had stood in the calendar room and heard the reserve committed to candles, and I had watched the relief coffer poured into cloth of silver. But I am a guard, and it is not a guard's place to answer such a question, and even if it had been my place, I could not have borne to say the answer aloud to that mud-caked boy at my gate. So I did the one thing my post did permit. I sent the alarm up the palace, and I sent for an officer, and I stayed with the rider and gave him my own cloak and told him help was being roused, and I prayed to whatever hears a guard that it was true. The palace woke, and here is where the 2 women I have been telling you about walked into the same room at last, in the small dark hours, over a drowning town, and showed the realm, showed me, exactly what each of them was made of. They gathered in the council room, the queen roused from sleep in a plain robe with her hair unpinned, the prince consort Aldrich at her shoulder, Mistress Haldon with her ledgers, 2 officers of the guard, and Lady Verrick, who arrived even at that hour entirely composed, her gray silk perfect, as though she had been awake all night waiting to be magnificent about something. I stood the doorpost. I saw all of it. The queen heard the rider's message read aloud, and I watched something happen in her face that I had been waiting all autumn to see. The ornament fell away, and the queen underneath came fully awake for the first time in months. "How much of the reserve can reach Merrowfen by dawn?" she said. Not a speech. A question, sharp and working. "Boats, grain, the relief coffer, blankets, the palace physicians. How much, how fast, Mistress Haldon?" And Mistress Haldon, standing very straight, said the sentence that changed everything. "Majesty," she said, "there is no reserve. It was committed to the jubilee 8 weeks ago. The grain, the oil, the relief coffer, every barrel and every coin the crown holds against a hard season is downstairs in crates, or standing on the dais as flowers and candles and cloth of silver. I warned that a hard winter was coming and asked that the reserve be kept whole. I was overruled." She did not look at Lady Verrick when she said it. She did not have to. Every person in that room turned slowly and looked at Lady Verrick for her. I have thought many times about what a wiser, humbler person would have done in that moment. Would have said, "I was wrong. Here is everything. Strip the dais tonight. Take it all to the town." The reserve was not truly gone. It was flowers and candles and cloth, a day from being burned and eaten at a party. It could still be turned back into grain and boats and coin if someone with the authority ordered it turned back that hour. All it needed was for Lady Verrick to let go of the jubilee. She could not do it. I watched her not be able to do it, and it was the most frightening thing I saw all winter, more frightening than the mud-caked boy at my gate, because it showed me how completely a person can be owned by the thing they have decided they are. "Majesty," Lady Verrick said, and her voice was warm, steady, reasonable, the surgeon's and taxidermist's voice. "This is a tragedy, and of course we grieve for the river people. But we must not lose our heads. The jubilee is in 4 days. The eyes of the entire realm, every province, every foreign court are upon this palace. If the crown strips its own great celebration to send grain to one flooded town, we do not save the town. The water will do what it will do regardless. What we do is broadcast to the whole world that the monarchy of Eldermoor panicked, lowered itself, unmade its own magnificence at the first hard rain. We tell every frightened soul in the realm that the fixed star above them is not fixed after all. That does more harm, to more people, than any flood. I beg you hold the course. Send what small comfort we can spare, a token, a gesture of the crown's care, and let the jubilee stand undiminished. The people need to look up and see us unshaken. That is the truest help we can give them." She had, even then, a beautiful argument. She always did. She had spent 11 years building it, and she believed every word. And Queen Saralind looked at her for a long, long moment, and I saw her ask the empty air the 3 questions she thought no one ever heard. What is right? And what will it cost? And can I bear the cost? And I saw her finish asking them, and I saw her decide. "Lady Verrick," the queen said, and her voice was not loud either, but it was a different quiet than the courtiers. It was the quiet of a thing that has stopped being movable. "You have told me for 11 years that the crown is how it looks. I have let you believe I agreed, because the pageantry did no harm and it pleased you and it pleased the court, and I had larger things to spend myself on. But you have made a mistake tonight, and I need you to hear it plainly, because I do not think you have ever heard it before. The crown is not how it looks. The crown is what it does when it costs everything. There are old people on the roofs of Merrowfen and children in the water, and the reason there is no reserve to send them is that we turned the reserve into candles for a party about ourselves. There is no argument in the world, and yours is the finest I have ever heard. That will make me light those candles while my people drown by their light." She turned from Lady Verrick as though the Mistress of Ceremonies had already ceased to be in the room, and she began to give orders, and the orders were the most beautiful things I ever heard spoken in that palace. Mistress Haldon, the jubilee is over. Every barrel of grain, every cask of oil, every yard of cloth, every coin of the relief coffer, turn it all back into what it was before it was a party. I want it on carts by first light. Take the 2,000 candles too. A flooded town in winter needs light more than a ballroom does. Aldrich roused the palace guard, the household, the physicians, every able hand who will come. Send riders down the valley to every town above the flood. The crown is coming to Merrowfen and asks for boats, ropes, and strong backs, and will remember every soul who answers. Open the palace itself, the great halls, the kitchens, the stables. Any river person we can bring out of the water comes here, is warmed here, is fed here, sleeps here, in the crown's own house, for as long as the water stands. Joran and Malin will help in the kitchens. It is time they learned what a crown is for. She was already moving toward the door, already pulling a plain traveling cloak around the robe she had slept in. And bring me a horse. I am going to Merrowfen myself. Tonight. Majesty, one of the officers began, because it was midnight and freezing and the roads were ice, and a sovereign does not ride into a flood. It is not safe. Send the household in your name. I have sent things in my name for 10 years, the queen said, and for one moment the whole force of the woman came through, the thing Lady Verrick had spent an autumn trying to arrange into stillness. Tonight I am going to send myself. My people are on their roofs in the dark believing the crown has forgotten them. I will be in Merrowfen by dawn so that the first light they see is the crown standing in the water with them. That is not a risk. That is the whole of what I am for. Now bring me the horse. And she went, in a plain cloak in the freezing dark, with her husband beside her and a handful of guards and the first carts of grain rumbling behind. The Queen of Eldermoor rode down the valley road toward a drowning town, past the mud-caked boy at my gate, who saw her, and understood who she was, and burst into the kind of weeping that a man does when a thing he had stopped hoping for arrives, and out into the night. I held my post at the riverside gate and watched the small, determined shape of her disappear into the dark toward the water, and I will tell you that the new guard flinch that had troubled me all autumn was gone, burned clean out of me, and what stood in its place was something I did not have a word for yet but have since learned to call devotion. Behind her, in the emptying palace, Lady Verrick stood in the council room and watched 11 years of arrangement come apart in a single night, and began. I would learn all of this over the days that followed to plan how to survive it. Because understand, to Lady Verrick what the Queen had just done was not brave. It was a catastrophe. A monarch had, in her certain view, panicked and unmade her own magnificence at the first hard rain, exactly as she had warned, had torn down the great definition of the rain, and gone splashing into a muddy town like a common relief worker, and would return, if she returned at all, diminished, lowered, a queen the realm could no longer look up to. Lady Verrick genuinely believed the rain had been mortally wounded that night. And she believed with equal certainty that it fell to her, the one who understood magnificence, the one who had always been the true keeper of the crown's greatness, to control the story of what had happened so that the damage could be contained. So while the Queen rode into the water, Lady Verrick sat down and began, very calmly, to compose the account the realm would receive. It would be a masterpiece of quiet cruelty, the largest she had ever attempted, and it would be aimed straight at the heart of the woman she had spent an autumn making small. The account would say that in a moment of crisis the young queen had lost her composure entirely, had abandoned the great jubilee that honored her own reign, insulting every province and foreign court that had prepared to attend, and had rushed off impulsively into a flood she could do nothing to stop, endangering herself and embarrassing the crown, all against the sober counsel of her advisers. It would paint her as a good-hearted but unsteady young woman, ruled by feeling, unfit to be left alone with a hard decision. A woman who plainly needed a steady, magnificent hand behind her to keep the realm from following her into the mud. And the steady hand, the account would gently imply without ever quite saying it, was the Mistress of Ceremonies who had counseled restraint and been overruled, and who now, sorrowfully, must help hold the dignity of the crown together while its sovereign learned wisdom. It was, as an act of pure envy dressed as loyalty, almost perfect, and Lady Verrick had the machinery to make it stick, the calendar, the masters of ceremony, the channels that shaped how the realm saw its crown, all of them hers. She would let the account leak in the right rooms. She would arrange the return, whenever the Queen came back, to look like a chastened homecoming rather than a triumph. She would, one more time, arrange the Queen into the shape she needed her to be, small, unsteady, in need of Lady Verrick. She did not know she could not know, because she had never in 11 years walked into a flood or held a name in her heart or asked the 3 questions in the dark. What was actually happening down the valley, in the black water, where a queen in a plain cloak was, hour by freezing hour, winning the whole heart of a realm? I know what happened at Merrowfen because I was ordered down the valley on the 2nd day, with the 3rd convoy of carts, to reinforce the guard around the Queen. And so, for 2 days and a night, I stood my post not in a gilded hall but on a broken embankment above black rushing water, and I saw with my own eyes the thing that Lady Verrick was, at that very hour, telling the court had been a disaster. It was not a disaster. It was the finest thing I have ever seen a human being do. The Queen had reached Merrowfen before dawn on the 1st day, as she had promised, and she had not stood on the dry high ground and directed. She had gone into the water. I arrived to find the sovereign of Eldermoor waist-deep in a freezing flooded street in a plain cloak gone black with mud, working a rope line to bring an old man off a roof, her hair plastered to her face, her hands raw, and around her. This is the part Lady Verrick could never have imagined, a town and a whole valley working with her because of her. Word had gone up the valley that the Queen herself was in the water, and it had done what no order in her name had ever done. It had brought everyone. Fishermen came down from the upper towns with their boats. Farmers came with their carts and their strong sons. The upper valley emptied itself into Merrowfen not because the crown commanded it, but because the crown was standing in the flood with its people, and you cannot watch your queen wade into black water for a stranger's grandmother and stay home by your fire. That is not how the human heart is built. Lady Verrick had spent 11 years believing a magnificent, remote crown was what kept a frightened people from despair. She was exactly wrong. It was this, a queen close enough to touch, ruined and raw and unafraid, doing the work beside them, that broke the despair like ice and turned a drowning town into a valley of thousands pulling in the same direction. I stood my post on the embankment and I guarded her while she worked, and I saw the small true things that no account written in a warm palace could ever capture. I saw her sit down in the mud and hold a shaking child wrapped in one of the 2,000 candles worth of blankets, and learn the child's name, and use it. I saw her open the palace carts herself, and put warm bread into the hands of people who had watched their homes go under, and I saw her not once make a speech about it. I saw her, on the 2nd night, when a young father was swept off a broken cart trying to reach his boy, order the whole rescue to stop and turn and put every boat and rope in the valley on finding that one man, because, she said, standing white-faced in the torchlight over the black water, we do not spend one life to save the day. Every single one of them is the whole of the reason we are here. And I saw the valley find him, cold and half-drowned but alive, and I saw the Queen weep openly with the mother, in the mud, in front of everyone and lose no dignity at all by it. She gained it. I watched a queen become, over 2 days in the water, more magnificent to those people than any dais Lady Verrick could have built in 1,000 years. And she did it by making herself smaller than any of them, by kneeling in the mud, by being nobody's fixed star and everybody's neighbor. And they loved her for it. I have never seen love like it, and I do not expect to again. By the second day, the people of Merrowfen and the whole upper valley did not speak of the queen the way you speak of a jewel. They spoke of her the way you speak of your own, fiercely, wetly, with the whole heart. An old woman she had pulled off a roof caught my sleeve as I stood my post and said, "You guard her, do you? You keep her safe, girl, you hear me? That one's ours now, she's the realm's own. There's not a soul in this valley wouldn't stand in the water for her." And I understood, standing there in the cold, that something had happened that could not be unhappened. Lady Verrick was in the palace at that hour composing an account of a foolish young queen who had panicked and lowered herself. And every hour she wrote, the truth was writing itself deeper into 10,000 hearts along the valley. The truth that this queen was the truest thing the crown had ever produced, and that a realm which had been shown a jewel for a year had just met the woman, and would never again mistake the one for the other. The story went up the valley, ahead of the water going down. It went from Merrowfen to the upper towns to the market roads to the far shires, not carried by any master of ceremony, not shaped by any keeper of the calendar, but carried the way true things are carried, mouth to mouth, by people who had been in the water or had a cousin who had. By the time the flood began to fall, the Kingdom of Eldermoor had made up its own mind about its queen, and its mind was not the mind Lady Verrick was so carefully building in the rooms of the palace. Two accounts of the same night were now racing each other across the realm. The courtiers, that a young queen had panicked and unmade her own magnificence, and the valleys, that a queen had walked into black water for her people and won. And the courtiers' account, for all its machinery, had one fatal flaw that Lady Verrick was constitutionally unable to see. It was a lie, and the other one was what 10,000 people had watched with their own eyes. But I did not yet know how it would land, and neither did the realm, because the two accounts had not yet met in the open. That meeting was coming, and Lady Verrick was arranging it. Arranging, with all her genius, the moment of the queen's return to the palace, which she intended to be the moment her account won. Here is what she planned, and I learned it in pieces, the way a guard learns everything. The jubilee could not simply vanish. Too much had been built, too many provinces and courts had been summoned. So Lady Verrick, with breathtaking nerve, decided to keep it, to keep the great gathering, the assembled realm, the foreign courts, all of it, but to turn it from a jubilee into something else. A ceremony of the crown steadying, she called it in the notes I glimpsed on her table. A solemn, magnificent occasion at which the rain, shaken by the flood, would be seen to compose itself again, to reassert its dignity, to demonstrate to the watching world that the monarchy of Eldermoor was, after its moment of impulse, once more a fixed and steady star. The queen would be received back into the palace on the fourth night before the whole assembled realm, and Lady Verrick would arrange that reception so completely, so magnificently, that it would look like a chastened homecoming, a sovereign returning humbled to the steadying hand of her court, and the account of the panicked young queen would be sealed into the realm's memory in front of every witness that mattered. It was, I have to say it plainly, a monstrous piece of work, and it was the finest thing she ever did. She was building a trap out of ceremony itself, a golden cage lowered over the exact moment of the queen's greatest triumph, designed to make the triumph look like a disgrace. And she had the calendar and the masters of ceremony and the assembled realm to do it with. On the fourth night, in the great hall where the jubilee dais had stood, Lady Verrick would win. She would arrange the queen, one last and total time, into the shape of the unsteady ornament who needed her. Or she would lose everything in front of everyone all at once. She did not know which. Neither did I, and that is the false dawn of this story, the moment when it looked, to anyone standing in the palace, as though the arranger might yet win, because the valley's love was 3 days' ride away and Lady Verrick's machinery was in the room. The fourth night came, and I was posted inside the great hall for the ceremony of the crown steadying. And so I stood at the very center of the trap while it was sprung, and saw every thread of it, and could not say one word. Lady Verrick had outdone herself. She had taken the ruins of the Jubilee and rebuilt them in 3 days into something colder and cleverer. The great hall was hung not in the cloth of silver of celebration, but in a deep, sober blue, the color, she had let it be understood, of a crown that had passed through a storm and come out chastened and dignified. The dais still stood, but she had lowered the throne upon it and set beside it a second, smaller seat, and I understood the geometry the moment I saw it. The queen would be received not in triumph, but in a posture of return, of being welcomed back by a steady court, and the smaller seat was for Lady Verrick, who would stand as the sober keeper of the crown's dignity through its unsteady hour. Every province had been assembled. The foreign courts were in their galleries, and the masters of ceremony, all hers, had been drilled in an order of events designed to tell one story with total clarity, that a good but impulsive young queen was being gently, magnificently, folded back into the wisdom of her court. She had even written the queen's part. There was to be a moment early in the ceremony when the queen would be invited to speak briefly of the trial the realm had passed through, 90 seconds, the same muzzle as the harvest audience, enough to be seen and not enough to be heard, and then the masters would move smoothly to the true business of the evening, the reassertion of the crown's magnificence, with Lady Verrick at its steadying center. It was the harvest audience made vast. It was every arrangement of the autumn brought to a single point, and it was going to be performed in front of the entire realm. I stood my post at the foot of the dais, in the exact spot where I had stood on the day of the muzzled audience, and I watched Lady Verrick move through the hall in the last hour before the doors opened, and I will tell you that she was, that night, at the absolute height of her power and her certainty. She was serene. She was magnificent. She checked the fall of the blue banners and the placement of the sober candles, a modest number now, dignified, nothing like the 2,000 that had gone down the valley, and she arranged the great people of the court into their tiers, and she did not see me, and she did not, I am certain, feel the smallest tremor of doubt. She had spent 11 years learning that how a thing looks is what a thing is, and she had built in this hall the most complete-looking thing of her life. In her certain heart the queen had already lost, and the only question left was how gracefully the arranging would be done. She had one flaw in her design, and it was the same flaw she had carried all along, and it was fatal. She had built her account of that flood night on the belief that no one who mattered had seen the truth. The realm assembled in the galleries, the foreign courts, the great people of Eldermoor, none of them had been in the water. They had only the accounts, and Lady Verrick controlled the accounts, or believed she did. She had forgotten, because she had never in her life been able to see it, that there is a kind of witness her machinery could not reach. She had forgotten the valley. The doors opened and the ceremony began, and for the first hour it went exactly as she had built it. The court processed in its perfect tiers. The blue banners fell just so. The sober candles burned. Lady Verrick took her small, steady seat beside the lowered throne with the grave, sorrowful dignity of a woman helping to hold a shaken crown together, and I saw the galleries reading her exactly as she intended, the steady hand, the keeper of magnificence, the one who had counseled restraint. The story was being told, thread by thread, and it was landing. And then the queen came home. I heard it before I saw it, and so did everyone in the hall, a sound coming up from the outer courts and the streets beyond the palace, a sound that did not belong to any arrangement Lady Verrick had made, a sound the masters of ceremony had no order for. It was cheering. Not the polite, marshaled cheer of an assembled court, but a great, rolling, uncontrollable roar coming closer, the sound of an enormous crowd that had gathered in the freezing dark outside the palace gates, and I would learn that they had come up the valley behind her, the people of Merrowfen and the upper towns, hundreds and then thousands of them, walking 3 days through the cold to see their queen come home, and had massed at the palace gates and along the whole road, and were now roaring her name into the night in a voice that 11 years of court arrangement had no answer for. I saw Lady Verrick's face change for the first time that night, only a flicker. She did not yet understand it. But some deep instinct in the arranger heard in that roar, a thing she had not scheduled, and her serenity showed its first hairline crack. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the Queen of Eldermoor walked in. She had not been arranged. That was the first thing everyone saw, and it went through the assembled realm like a current. She wore no robe of state, no jewels, no crown. She had come deliberately in a plain dark traveling dress, clean but simple, her hands still raw and red from the ropes in the cold, and she walked up the length of that great blue-hung hall alone, without procession, without the tears, with the roar of 10,000 valley people still pouring in through the open doors behind her. And where Lady Verrick had built a homecoming of chastened return, the realm and the galleries saw something else entirely, because their own eyes told them a different story than the one they had been given. They saw a queen come straight from the water, unadorned, with a whole valley of common people roaring their love for her at the gates, and every soul in that hall understood, in the space of her walk to the dais, that they were not watching a chastened young woman being steadied by her court. They were watching the arrival of the most beloved sovereign the Kingdom of Eldermoor had ever had. And Lady Verrick, in her small, steady seat beside the lowered throne, watched her entire 11-year arrangement invert itself in front of the whole world, thread by thread, and could do nothing to stop it, because the one thing her machinery could not reach was the truth 10,000 people had seen with their own eyes and carried 3 days through the cold to lay at the gates of the palace. The masters of ceremony, drilled to their marks, tried to run the arrangement anyway. It is what trained people do. They perform the plan even as the ground opens. A master stepped forward as the queen reached the dais and began the scripted words, that Her Majesty was invited to speak briefly of the trial the realm had passed through. The 90-second muzzle, the same one from the harvest audience, ready to be clamped down the moment she had been seen and before she could be heard. But you cannot muzzle a queen the realm has already decided to love. That muzzle only works on a jewel, on an ornament, on a woman the room has agreed to see as decoration. The room had stopped agreeing, and Saralind, who had let the muzzle work for a year because the pageantry did no harm, did not let it work now. She stepped up onto the dais, and she did not take the lowered throne, and she did not so much as glance at the small, steady seat where Lady Verrick sat. She turned and faced the assembled realm and the open doors and the roar beyond them, and she began to speak, and no master of ceremony in Eldermoor had the standing to move her along, because the whole hall was leaning toward her and would have torn down any man who tried. "You were told a story about a flood," the queen said, and her voice was quiet and it filled the hall the way the true things do. "I know what the story was because it was arranged carefully, and I have great respect for the skill of the arranging. You were told that your queen lost her composure, that in a hard hour she panicked and abandoned a great celebration of her own reign, and rushed off impulsively into a flood she could do nothing about, against the sober counsel of wiser heads. You were meant to see, tonight, a young woman being gently steadied by her court after a foolish night. She let that sit. You could hear the whole realm holding its breath, and I saw Lady Verrick's face in the light of the sober candles, and it had gone very still, the stillness of a person who has just heard the trap named aloud by the animal it was set for, and does not yet know how it can possibly know. I will tell you what actually happened," the queen went on, "and then you may decide for yourselves which story to keep, because I have found that a realm always knows the truth when it is finally allowed to hear it. A river rose, and a town drowned, and there were old people on their roofs and children in the water. And the reserve the crown holds against exactly such a night, the grain, the oil, the coin set aside to save our people when the worst comes, was gone. It had been spent 8 weeks before on candles and cloth of silver and imported flowers for a celebration about me, about how magnificent your crown could be made to look." She paused. "I did not know that until the night the water rose. When I learned it, I had a choice. I could hold the celebration and send a token of comfort to the drowning and let the realm keep looking up at a crown that appeared unshaken. Or I could tear the celebration down, turn the candles back into grain and go into the water myself. I was counseled, sincerely and with great skill, to hold the celebration. I was told that a magnificent, unshaken crown was worth more to a frightened people than any barrel of grain. Her eyes moved then, once, and only once, to the small steady seat, to Lady Verrick and back to the realm, and she did not name her, and the not naming was the most merciful and most total thing I have ever watched one person do to another. "I do not believe that," the Queen said. "I will never believe it. A crown is not how it looks. A crown is what it does when it costs everything. So I went to Merrowfen and I went into the water, and I want to be very clear with every province and every court in this hall about what that was, because it is going to be told two ways and I would like you to have the truth. It was not composure lost. It was composure spent on the only thing composure is for, and I was not alone in the water. The whole valley came, not because I commanded them. I have commanded things for 10 years and the valley has never once emptied itself for me. They came because a crown was standing in the flood with them, and you cannot watch that and stay home. We saved the town. We lost no one. And I have come home tonight in the dress I worked in, with the mud barely off my hands, to tell you that this, not the candles, not the banners, not the magnificent fixed star, this is what your crown is, and what it will be for as long as I wear it." And the hall broke. I do not mean it applauded. It broke, the way ice breaks all at once, along a line that has been forming for a long time. The galleries came to their feet. The provinces roared. The foreign courts, who had come to witness a chastened homecoming, rose to their feet for a sovereign the like of whom they plainly did not have at home. And through the open doors the 10,000 of the valley, hearing the roar go up inside, answered it from the freezing dark until the whole palace shook with a single enormous voice, and the voice was love, and it was for the Queen, and there was not one thread of Lady Verrick's arrangement left standing anywhere in it. I stood my post at the foot of the dais, and I did not move, and I held my face still, and inside my chest the thing my older comrade Corvith had told me about, the caring so hard you could break the world open, held anyway, rang like a struck bell, because I was watching a good woman win a whole kingdom's heart by being exactly who she was when it cost everything, and I was permitted only to stand and see it, and the standing and the seeing were, in that moment, the finest thing I had ever been allowed to do. And then I turned my eyes, as a guard learns to do without moving his head, to the small steady seat beside the lowered throne, to Lady Verrick, because a guard's true work is to see the whole of a room, and there was one person in that whole roaring hall for whom this was not triumph but the end of the world, and I was the only person watching her. She had not moved. That was the first thing. In a hall of 10,000 people rising and roaring, Lady Ottiline Verrick sat perfectly still in her small steady seat, upright, composed, her gloved hands folded in her lap, her chin level, the arranger's composure, the 11-year habit of magnificence, holding on out of sheer trained muscle over a thing that had already died underneath it. And I watched from 6 feet away, over the space of the next long minute, that composure begin to come apart. It did not go all at once. That is not how a thing like Lady Verrick breaks. It goes the way a great sea wall goes, first a single seam, then a spreading crack, then the whole face of it, and only at the very end the collapse. I saw the seam first, a small muscle at the corner of her jaw that began to work once, twice, as though she were chewing on the roar of the hall and could not swallow it. Then her folded hands. The gloved fingers, which had been perfectly still, began to press into one another, harder and harder, the knuckles rising white through the kidskin, the way a person grips something that is being pulled out of their hands by a current too strong to fight. And then her eyes, which had been fixed with trained level composure on the middle distance, the very trick I had been drilled in, the fixing of the eyes to keep the face still, her eyes began helplessly to move, to dart, around the hall. At the risen galleries, at the roaring provinces, at the foreign courts on their feet, at the Queen standing unadorned and beloved in the center of it all, and back, and around again, searching, I understood, for a single face that was reading the room the way she read it, a single ally who saw the disaster and the lowering and the panic where the whole world was seeing only love, searching for someone who would confirm that she was still right, and finding no one, not one face in 10,000. That was the crack spreading. She had built her entire life on the certainty that she saw the crown truly and the rest of the world saw only the surface. And now the whole world was looking at the exact thing she had spent an autumn calling a disaster, and calling it the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. And there was not one other person in all that hall who saw it her way. And I watched her understand, slowly, terribly, in real time, that this meant it was not the world that had been wrong. 11 years of certainty require an audience to survive. Hers had just, to the last soul, defected to the truth. And a certainty with no audience left is only a person, alone, in a roaring room, discovering that everything they were sure of was wrong. The break came when the Queen did the thing that finished her, and the Queen did not even know she was doing it, which is why it was so total. Saralind, at the height of the roar, raised her raw red hands for quiet and got it and said one last thing to the hall. "There is one more truth I owe you," she said, "and it is a good one. Not a barrel of the reserve was wasted. Every candle, every coin, every yard of cloth we had spent on making the crown look magnificent, we turned it back into grain and boats and blankets, and it saved a town. So let no one mourn the jubilee. It was not cancelled. It was spent. It became the finest thing this crown has ever done. And I can think of no better way to have marked 10 years of my reign than to have poured every scrap of its magnificence into the black water to bring my people home." And the hall, at that, did not roar. It did something worse for Lady Verrick. It wept. 10,000 people in the hall and at the gates wept with love, because the Queen had just taken the courtier's entire indictment, the reckless spending of the magnificence, and revealed it as the reign's crowning glory. And Lady Ottiline Verrick lost control entirely. I was the only one watching, and I have never told anyone what I saw until now, because a guard sees things that are not his to spread. But I will tell it here, because it is the whole point of everything I have written, the thing my drilling was for. She came up out of the small, steady seat. Not gracefully, there was nothing left of the grace. She came up the way a person comes up who cannot bear one more second of sitting still inside their own skin, and her chin was no longer level, and her hands were no longer folded. They were pressed flat against the front of her gray silk, as though she were holding a wound. And her face, the face I had watched glide through the palace for a whole autumn with the serene certainty of a woman who has never once doubted she was right, her face had come completely apart. The mouth was working with no words. The eyes were wild, wet, and I understood the wetness was not grief but fury, the pure scalding fury of a person watching the entire world applaud the exact thing they had staked their whole life on calling worthless. She took a step, and another off the dais, toward the center, toward the Queen, toward the roaring hall, and for one moment I did not know what she meant to do, and my hand was ready, because a guard's first duty stood ready in me even as the rest of me only watched. She did not reach the Queen. She got 3 steps into that vast roaring hall of 10,000 people who loved their sovereign, 3 steps into the open where every arrangement she had ever made had died. And there, in front of the assembled realm and the foreign courts and the whole watching world she had spent 11 years performing magnificence for, Lady Ottiline Verrick lost the last of it. The composure that had been her whole identity, the train-level stillness she had used to make everyone else feel small, simply left her all at once, the sea wall going down. She spun to the tears of the court, to the masters of ceremony she had drilled, and she began to speak, too loud, the words tumbling and cracking, that they did not understand that they were fools, that this was a catastrophe dressed as a triumph, that the crown had lowered itself and they were cheering its lowering, that she alone saw, she had always alone seen, that the magnificence was the monarchy and they were watching it die and clapping, and her voice climbed and broke and climbed again. And the great people of the court she had arranged for 11 years turned their faces away from her, one by one, embarrassed, appalled, and no longer afraid, and that turning away was the last thing that finished her. She saw it. She saw the whole court she had ruled through their fear of her poise watch her poise shatter, and she had nothing underneath it, no love earned, no name held in any heart, no valley that would walk 3 days for her, nothing but the arrangement, and the arrangement was gone. And so there was nothing left of Lady Verrick at all except a proud woman standing alone in the center of a hall, coming completely apart, in front of everyone, undone by no enemy and no accident but by her own envy and her own overreach, which had spent 11 years building the exact stage on which she would finally, publicly break. And here is the thing I learned that night, the thing that made me a guard for the whole rest of my life. Nobody stopped her. Nobody had to. The Queen did not order her removed. The court did not shout her down. I did not step forward, my hand had been ready, but my hand was not needed, and I let it rest because I understood, standing 6 feet away, that the most powerful thing anyone could do in that hall was nothing at all. Lady Verrick was destroying herself far more completely than any punishment could have, and the whole realm's kindest and most total answer to her was simply to let her, to stand still, and let her own envy finish the work her own overreach had begun. That is the power the old Bible of my profession calls restraint, and I had thought before that night that it meant not moving when you were provoked. I learned that it means far more. It means having the strength to do nothing while a wrong destroys itself, because your doing something would only give it an enemy to blame instead of a mirror to face. The Queen had that strength. The whole hall, following her, found it, and I, at my post, finally understood that the stillness I had been drilled in was not the absence of power. It was the highest form of it. It was the Queen who ended the moment, and she ended it the way she did everything, by being good in the load-bearing way that costs something. When Lady Verrick had wound down at last into a shaking silence, alone in the center of the turned-away court, Saralind did not let her stand there to be jeered. She came down off the dais in her plain dark dress, and she crossed to the woman who had spent an autumn trying to unmake her, and she did not gloat, and she did not accuse, and she did not name in front of the realm the scheme that I and Mistress Ceremonies and the Queen herself all knew by heart. She simply took Lady Verrick's arm, gently, the way you steady someone who is about to fall, and she said something to her, low, that only the two of them and the guard 6 feet away could hear. You believed it was a kindness, the Queen said. I know you did. You believed the magnificence was the mercy. You were wrong, and it has cost you everything, and I am sorry for that because I do not think you ever once knew you were being cruel. Go home, Ottiline. Go home and rest. No one will speak of this tomorrow if I have anything to say about it. But you will not keep the calendar again, and you will not arrange this crown again, because I have learned this winter what the crown is for, and it is not for looking magnificent. It is for the water. Go home. And she released her arm and turned back to her realm, and Lady Verrick, with the last shred of the composure that had been her whole life, or perhaps only with the numbness of a person whose world has ended, walked the length of that great hall alone, through the turned-away court, out the doors, past the roaring valley and out of the palace and out of this story. I never saw her again. I am told she went to a small house in the country and lived quietly and never spoke of that night. And I hope, though I have no way to know, that somewhere in the quiet she came at last to understand the thing the Queen had been merciful enough not to say aloud. That the realm had never needed her magnificence, and had only ever needed someone to walk into the water, and that she could have been that person any day of 11 years, and had spent every one of those days making sure she never had to be. The Queen went back up onto the dais then, and the ceremony of the crown steadying became, without one banner being changed, the truest jubilee the Kingdom of Eldermoor had ever held, not a celebration of how the crown looked, but of what it had done. The valley came in through the open doors, mud still on their boots, and the foreign courts came down from their galleries, and the great people of Eldermoor who had turned their faces from Lady Verrick turned them toward their Queen, and the whole realm, high and low, celebrated together until dawn, a sovereign who had won their hearts not by asking for them, but by spending herself on their behalf when it cost everything she had. I stood my post until the last light of it, and when the hall had emptied at last and the gray morning came up over the palace, my older comrade Corvith found me at the door where I still stood, and he looked at my face, and he did not need to ask what I had seen, because he had stood in that hall too at the far post, and had watched the same thing. "Now you know," he said, "what the stillness is for." "Now I know," I said. I have stood my post at Harrowgate Palace for many years since that winter, and I have seen a great deal, and I have learned that Corvith was right about all of it, that a guard is not furniture but the last honest witness in a house full of arrangers, that the stillness is caring so hard you could break the world open and holding it anyway, and that the highest power a person can hold is the restraint to stand still and let the truth arrive on its own. I learned all of it in one winter, from two women who could not have understood each other in 100 years, one who believed the crown was how it looked and lost everything the night the realm saw through her, and one who believed the crown was what it did when it cost everything, and won a kingdom's whole heart by walking in a plain cloak into the black water for her people. They asked me once, years later, a young guard newly posted, flinching inside the way I used to flinch, how a person stands still and watches a wrong and says nothing until the moment duty lets him speak. And I told her what I have written here. I told her about the night I watched a proud woman lose control entirely in a hall of 10,000 people, undone by her own envy, while a good queen who had won the realm's heart stood by and with the whole strength of her mercy did nothing at all. And I told her the thing it took me a whole winter to learn and a lifetime to be sure of, that the guard who can stand still through that, who can see the whole truth of a thing and hold his peace and his face and his hand until the exact moment they are needed, is not the weakest person in the room. He is the strongest, and so one still winter's watch at a time are you.